She was pushing a gray mop bucket across the Italian marble when she heard the lie that was about to cost a very dangerous man $500 million. Amara Vance didn't stop the rhythm of her stroke, didn't let the rubber wheels squeak, and didn't look up from the reflection of the city lights in the floor wax. That was the secret to surviving the night shift at the Aegis Tower, Atlanta's glass and steel monolith where the air always smelled like expensive cologne and fresh betrayal. You learned quickly how to make your presence feel like part of the furniture while your brain was deconstructing every word spoken in the room. Amara emptied a trash bin by the mahogany sideboard, replaced the liner, and disappeared into the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Then she moved her cart closer to the head of the table and listened harder. Now, before we go any further, if you've ever sat in a room and watched someone you trust look you in the eye and spin a web of lies while you stayed silent, this story is going to hit different. Stay with me, because what this invisible janitor did next shattered a corporate empire and changed her life in ways she never saw coming. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from, and would you have risked your life to speak up, or would you have kept mopping? Subscribe now, because by the end of this video, you might realize the person cleaning the room is the only one who really knows what's happening in it. The executive suite was a fortress of glass on the 60th floor, looking out over a rainy Atlanta skyline that blurred into streaks of gold and gray. On the polished table sat a contract, a $500 million acquisition, resting there like a live grenade with the pin halfway pulled. Amara had worked at Aegis for 7 months, 7 months of scrubbing toilets for men who earned her annual salary in a lunch break, and 7 months of taking the MARTA home to a small apartment where the only mail was a stack of past due notices from the oncology ward for her mother, Ifeoma. She was invisible by necessity. She needed this paycheck. But some lies are so loud they drown out the sound of survival. At the center of the table sat Kang Dae-hun. He possessed a terrifying, absolute stillness, the kind of composure you only find in men who have already decided exactly how they'll destroy you if you cross them. Standing to his right was his protege, Julian Sterling. Sharp suit, expensive watch, and a smile that looked perfectly trustworthy right up until you realized it never reached his eyes. He was leaning over the contract, pointing at a subclause in Schedule B, the same kind of bankruptcy trap that had been used to frame Amara and ruin her career years ago. Julian looked at the most powerful man in the room and lied with the confidence of a brother. Amara gripped the handle of her mop until her knuckles turned white. She knew that clause, she knew that lie, and she knew that if she didn't speak in the next 10 seconds, the man at the table was walking into a trap he'd never get out of. The fluorescent lights of the Aegis Tower didn't illuminate the executive floors at 2 a.m. They merely vibrated. A low-frequency hum that felt like it was drilling directly into Amara's skull. She moved through the corridors like a specter, her presence marked only by the faint scent of lemon-scented industrial cleaner and the rhythmic swish-thud of her damp mop. To the night security team, she was just the girl on the late shift. To the executives who occasionally stayed past midnight, she was part of the architecture, no more significant than the expensive ergonomic chairs or the automated espresso machines. Invisibility was a habit she'd perfected, but it was an expensive one to maintain. As she wiped down the glass partitions of the 60th floor lobby, her mind wasn't on the streak-free shine. It was on the folded piece of paper tucked into the waistband of her navy blue scrubs. It was a final notice from the hospital's billing department, printed on an aggressive shade of pink that seemed to glow through the fabric of her uniform. The number at the bottom, $14,200, was a mountain she was trying to move with a teaspoon. Every time her phone buzzed with a text from the night nurse at the oncology ward, Amara's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. Your mother is resting, but the new medication is pending insurance approval. Insurance approval was a polite corporate euphemism for, we need more money. 2 years ago, Amara Vance had been the one signing the checks, not scrubbing the floors. She had been a rising star in forensic auditing, a woman who could find a hidden decimal point in a 1,000-page ledger. But one clerical error she refused to ignore had been twisted by her mentor, Dominic Graves, into a narrative of embezzlement. The trial didn't just take her license, it took her dignity and her savings. Now, the genius who could deconstruct a multinational shell company was spending her nights cleaning the toilets of the men who ran them. She entered the executive boardroom, the inner sanctum, where the air was thick with the smell of expensive bourbon and lingering tension. The trash bin near the head of the table was overflowing with discarded drafts of a merger agreement. As she reached down to empty it, her eyes instinctively scanned a crumpled page. Most people would see jargon. Amara saw a crime. Her pulse quickened. The numbers didn't just look wrong, they looked familiar. It was the same jagged mathematical signature she'd seen once before, the kind that preceded a total collapse. She looked at the empty chair where Kang Dae-hyun usually sat, then at the door where Julian Sterling would soon enter, and felt the weight of her invisibility start to crack. She was a woman drowning in debt, but she was still an auditor at heart, and the numbers were screaming. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom groaned shut, sealing out the hum of the vacuum cleaners and the distant sound of the city. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly, becoming pressurized and thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and old money. Kang Dae-hyun didn't move as the two men entered. He remained seated at the head of the glass table, his silhouette framed by the sprawling, rain-slicked skyline of Atlanta. He was a steady and absolute stillness, his hands folded precisely over a leather-bound folder. To anyone else, he looked like a statue of power, but Amara, lingering in the corner with a microfiber cloth and a bottle of polish, saw the way his eyes tracked every vibration in the room. He wasn't just waiting, he was calculating. Julian Sterling broke the silence with the easy, practiced stride of a man who owned the air he breathed. He dropped a heavy, silver-tipped briefcase onto the table, a sound that echoed like a gavel in the quiet room. "It's a historic night, Mr. Kang," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as slippery. He flashed a smile that was perfectly calibrated for a magazine cover, radiating a smug, untouchable confidence. He moved around the table with predatory grace, laying out documents with a flourish, his movements designed to distract and dazzle. "The final adjustments have been made to the acquisition terms," Julian continued, leaning in toward Kang with the feigned intimacy of a loyal protege. "Everything we discussed regarding the debt-to-equity swap is finalized in Schedule B. It's a clean break from the old subsidiary. We sign tonight, and the Aegis Empire doubles its footprint by sunrise." He placed a high-end fountain pen next to the signature line, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a trap about to spring. Across from him, Kang remained unreadable. He didn't reach for the pen. He didn't even blink. He simply stared at the paper, his silence acting as a vacuum that sucked the air out of Julian's bravado. The contrast was jarring. Julian was all motion, all noise, all smug certainty. Kang was a deep, dark ocean, hiding whatever lay beneath the surface. From the shadows near the credenza, Amara felt a cold shiver trace down her spine. She saw the way Julian's hand hovered just a fraction of an inch too long over the contract, a tell she recognized from her days in the auditor's chair. He was overplaying the hand. He was too eager. As she moved to dust the nearby bookshelf, she caught a glimpse of the bolded text on the page Julian was so desperately highlighting. It wasn't a clean break. It was an anchor. She realized then that Julian wasn't just lying. He was executing a professional execution. The inner sanctum wasn't a place of business tonight. It was a crime scene, and the only witness was a woman holding a cleaning rag. The microfiber cloth in Amara's hand slowed its circular motion over the mahogany sideboard as her eyes locked onto the document resting beneath the soft glow of the pendant light. It was just a glance, the kind of peripheral observation she had trained herself to mask. But the numbers on the page didn't just sit there. They vibrated with a familiar predatory energy. There, buried in the fine print of Section 4, Paragraph C, was a cross-default clause linked to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. It was a bankruptcy trap, a sophisticated piece of financial engineering designed to look like a standard liability shield while actually acting as a kill switch. A cold, hollow sensation opened up in the pit of her stomach, a phantom pain from a life she thought she had buried. 2 years ago, she had stood in a much smaller office, staring at a nearly identical clause in a mid-size acquisition deal. She had pointed it out to Dominic Graves, her mentor, her friend, the man she trusted with her career. She remembered the way he had patted her shoulder, his voice warm and fatherly, as he told her she was overthinking it. 24 hours later, that clause had been triggered, the company had been gutted, and Amara had been left holding a paper trail that Dominic had meticulously rerouted to her desk. Seeing it now, printed on the heavy, cream-colored bond paper of the Aegis Tower, was like seeing a ghost. Julian Sterling wasn't just misrepresenting the deal. He was using the exact same mathematical fingerprint Dominic had used to destroy her. It was a shell game tactic. The acquisition target would be declared insolvent within 90 days of the merger, triggering a total liquidation that would funnel Kang Dae-hyun's personal assets directly into a protected offshore account controlled by the right-hand man. Amara's breath hitched, a tiny sound that felt like a gunshot in the silent room. She quickly looked down, focusing on a non-existent smudge on the woodwork, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't just a corporate mistake, it was an execution. Julian was smiling, his teeth white and sharp in the dim light, leaning in to whisper something about legacy and growth to a man who was seconds away from signing his own professional death warrant. She looked at the exit, then at the hospital bill still burning a hole in her pocket. If she stayed invisible, she stayed safe. She could keep her job, keep her mother's room, and let the billionaire fall. But as she watched Julian's hand slide the pen closer to Kang's fingers, the ghost of her own ruined career stood up in the corner of the room. The silence she had cultivated for months suddenly felt like a lie she could no longer afford to tell. The hum of the floor polisher in the hallway felt like a countdown. Amara's fingers gripped the trigger of the spray bottle so hard the plastic groaned. Behind her, the silence of the boardroom was broken only by the rhythmic, predatory scratching of Julian's fountain pen being uncapped. In her mind, a frantic, jagged tug of war was tearing her apart. "Mind your business, Amara," the voice of survival whispered, the voice that had kept her alive for 7 months in the shadows of Atlanta's elite. That voice reminded her of the oncology ward, the final notices, and the terrifying anonymity of her current life. If she spoke, she wasn't just risking a job, she was stepping back into the line of fire of a man who clearly played for keeps. But then there was the other voice, the one that sounded like the girl who had spent 4 years earning a degree in forensic accounting just to protect people from predators like the man sitting at that table. She looked at Julian Sterling's reflection in the dark glass of the window. He looked so certain, so untouchable. He was counting on her invisibility. He was counting on the fact that a woman in navy blue scrubs wouldn't know the difference between an asset purchase and a liability trap. He was using her mother's poverty as his greatest camouflage. She thought of her mother, Ifeoma, who had worked 2 cleaning jobs just to buy Amara her first professional suit. If she stayed silent, she was no better than the man who had framed her. She was letting the cycle of the shell game claim another victim, and this time she was the only one who could see the hand moving the cups. The air in the room seemed to thin as Kang Dae-hyun finally reached for the pen. His movements were slow, deliberate, and final. Amara felt a surge of cold indignation that burned through her fear. This wasn't just about a merger anymore. It was about the truth she had been forced to bury. She realized she couldn't go back to the studio apartment and look at those hospital bills, knowing she had stood by and watched a murder, even a corporate one, take place. She set the spray bottle down on the credenza with a click that sounded like a hammer being cocked on a pistol. She didn't think about the martyr ride home or the building manager's temper. She didn't think about the consequences. She simply turned, her eyes meeting Kang's unreadable gaze for the first time in 7 months. She took a step out of the shadows and into the light of the pendant lamp, her voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Don't sign that, Mr. Kang," she said, the words cutting through Julian's smug smile like a blade. "Because if you do, Julian gets your empire, and you get the bankruptcy charges." The silence that followed Amara's voice was so absolute it felt physical, a sudden drop in cabin pressure that made the ears ring. Julian Sterling's hand froze an inch above the mahogany, the fountain pen hovering like a staid executioner's blade. He didn't turn immediately. Instead, a slow, dark flush crept up the back of his neck, his composed facade fracturing in real time. When he finally looked at Amara, his expression wasn't one of confusion. It was pure, concentrated venom. "Excuse me?" he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and elitist rage. "Who allowed the help to speak? Mr. Kang, I am so sorry. I'll have building security remove this woman immediately." But Kang Dae-hyun didn't signal for security. He didn't even look at Julian. His unreadable gaze remained fixed on Amara, his dark eyes narrowing as if he were seeing her for the first time in 7 months. He set the pen down with a click that echoed through the room. "Let her finish," he commanded, the weight of his voice anchoring the room. Amara took a breath, the scent of industrial bleach in her lungs suddenly replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of a forensic audit. She didn't look like a janitor anymore. Her posture shifted, the phantom weight of her old professional life settling onto her shoulders. She stepped toward the table, her eyes scanning the document Julian had been so desperate to hide. "Section 4, paragraph C," he said, her voice steady and clinical. "You framed it as a standard indemnity clause, but look at the cross-default trigger linked to the Vanguard Holdings subsidiary. Vanguard is a shell, Mr. Kang. It's carrying $300 million in undisclosed debt from a failed crypto mining operation in Estonia. The moment you sign this merger, that debt is called. Under the terms of Schedule B, your personal assets in the Aegis Group become the primary collateral. Within 90 days, the subsidiary files for Chapter 11, the liquidation preference kicks in, and the entire Aegis portfolio is transferred to a trustee." She paused, her gaze shifting to Julian, whose face had gone from red to a ghostly, sickly gray. "A trustee whose primary beneficiary is an offshore account Julian opened in the Cayman Islands 6 months ago." The air in the boardroom turned frigid. Julian opened his mouth to protest, a stuttered, "That's absurd," dying in his throat as Amara reached out and pointed to a specific string of numbers in the ledger. "It's a classic shell game, Julian. I've seen this exact mathematical fingerprint before. You didn't just write a contract, you wrote a bankruptcy trap." Kang Dae-hyun stood up slowly, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. He leaned over the table, his eyes tracing the lines Amara had indicated. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy, until Kang looked up at Julian. The right-hand man tried to speak, but the smug confidence was gone, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed look of a cornered animal. The janitor's audit was complete, and the verdict was written in the sudden, terrifying coldness of Kang's smile. The violent scrape of a chair against the marble floor broke the trance. Julian Sterling scrambled backward, his hands up as if to ward off a physical blow. But there was nowhere to run in a room surrounded by glass and 60 stories of thin air. Kang Dae-hyun didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply looked at the 2 shadows standing by the door, men who had been invisible to Julian until this exact second. With a single sharp tilt of Kang's chin, the guards moved. They didn't use handcuffs. They used a grip that suggested Julian's arms would snap if he resisted. As they dragged the right-hand man toward the service elevator, Julian's polished facade finally dissolved into a series of panicked, high-pitched pleas that echoed down the hallway until the doors hissed shut, cutting him off mid-sentence. The silence that rushed back into the boardroom was colder than before. Amara stood her ground, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her hands still clutching the microfiber cloth like a shield. She expected a thank you or perhaps a question about how a janitor knew the intricacies of Estonian debt structures. Instead, the heavy double doors swung open again, and Mr. Henderson, the building's night manager, burst in. His face was a frantic shade of purple, his tie askew, and his eyes wide with the kind of terror reserved for men who have seen their career's obituary written in real time. "What is going on here?" Henderson hissed, his voice trembling as he looked from the billionaire to the woman in the navy blue scrubs. He didn't wait for an answer. He saw the disrupted meeting, the missing executive, and the janitor standing at the head of the table. To him, the math was simple. A breach of protocol was a breach of his contract. "Vance, what did you do? I told you, stay out of the light. You were told specifically to be a ghost." He turned to Kang, bowing so low it looked painful. "Mr. Kang, I am profoundly sorry. This woman is a temporary hire, clearly unstable. She will be dealt with immediately." He whipped back toward Amara, his finger trembling as he pointed toward the exit. "Give me your badge, now. You're done, Amara. Don't even bother coming back for your locker. We'll mail your final check, minus the cleaning fees for the disruption you've caused tonight. Get out." Amara felt the familiar weight of the world's indifference settling back onto her shoulders. She looked at Kang, searching for a sign of intervention, but the billionaire had turned his back to the room, staring out at the rain-slicked city as if she had already ceased to exist. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the plastic ID card that represented her mother's medicine and her own survival, and set it on the mahogany table. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked out of the inner sanctum, the squeak of her own shoes on the marble floor sounding like a derisive laugh. She had saved an empire, and in return, she had lost everything else. The humidity of the Atlanta night pressed against Amara like a damp wool blanket as she stepped out of the service entrance. The weight of her termination wasn't just emotional, it was a physical ache in her chest, timed to the rhythm of the MARTA bus she knew she'd already missed. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her mind a frantic ledger of dwindling options. No job meant no insurance. No insurance meant if Alama's treatment stopped. She had traded her mother's life for a billionaire's bank account, and the irony tasted like copper in her mouth. The alleyway behind the Aegis Tower was a narrow canyon of damp concrete and overflowing dumpsters, lit only by the flickering amber of a failing street lamp. Amara was halfway to the main road when the silence of the alley was broken by the sharp, rhythmic click of leather soles on pavement. She didn't have to turn around to know the vibration. It wasn't the heavy, tired tread of a night porter. It was the precise, aggressive stride of someone who had been waiting for her. "You really should have kept mopping, Amara," a voice hissed from the shadows. Julian Sterling stepped into the light, his tie gone, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who had seen his future incinerated in 10 minutes. Behind him, 2 men in nondescript dark windbreakers emerged from the mouth of the alley, blocking her exit. They weren't corporate types. They were the kind of fixers who specialized in making problems and people disappear into the Georgia clay. "You have no idea what you've cost me," Julian snarled, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "Do you think a man like Kang cares about a janitor? You're a footnote, and footnotes get erased." One of the men reached into his jacket, his hand closing around something heavy and metallic. Amara backed away, her heel catching on a stray piece of gravel, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked for a way out, but the brick walls seemed to close in. Then, the darkness at the far end of the alley shifted. A black sedan, its headlights extinguished, glided into the space with the predatory silence of a shark. The doors opened before the car had even fully stopped. Four men in charcoal suits, the same unyielding shadows Amara had seen in the boardroom, stepped out. They didn't pull weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere from a mugging to a battlefield. From the passenger side, Min-ho, Kang's right-hand security lead, stepped forward. He didn't look at Julian, he didn't look at the fixers. He walked straight to Amara and stood between her and the men who meant to hurt her. Mr. Kang is not fond of people touching his property, and as of 5 minutes ago, Ms. Vance, you are considered a high-value asset of the Aegis Group. Julian took a step back, his bravado vanishing as he realized he wasn't just fighting a janitor anymore, he was fighting a ghost with an army. As Min-ho's men moved forward with clinical efficiency, the invisible woman realized that for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't the one being hunted. The humidity of the Atlanta night pressed against Amara like a damp wool blanket as she stepped out of the service entrance. The weight of her termination wasn't just emotional, it was a physical ache in her chest, timed to the rhythm of the MARTA bus she knew she'd already missed. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her mind a frantic ledger of dwindling options. No job meant no insurance. No insurance meant if Alama's treatment stopped. She had traded her mother's life for a billionaire's bank account, and the irony tasted like copper in her mouth. The alleyway behind the Aegis Tower was a narrow canyon of damp concrete and overflowing dumpsters, lit only by the flickering amber of a failing street lamp. Amara was halfway to the main road when the silence of the alley was broken by the sharp, rhythmic click of leather soles on pavement. She didn't have to turn around to know the vibration. It wasn't the heavy, tired tread of a night porter. It was the precise, aggressive stride of someone who had been waiting for her. "You really should have kept mopping, Amara," a voice hissed from the shadows. Julian Sterling stepped into the light, his tie gone, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who had seen his future incinerated in 10 minutes. Behind him, 2 men in nondescript dark windbreakers emerged from the mouth of the alley, blocking her exit. They weren't corporate types. They were the kind of fixers who specialized in making problems and people disappear into the Georgia clay. "You have no idea what you've cost me," Julian snarled, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "Do you think a man like Kang cares about a janitor? You're a footnote, and footnotes get erased." One of the men reached into his jacket, his hand closing around something heavy and metallic. Amara backed away, her heel catching on a stray piece of gravel, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked for a way out, but the brick walls seemed to close in. Then, the darkness at the far end of the alley shifted. A black sedan, its headlights extinguished, glided into the space with the predatory silence of a shark. The doors opened before the car had even fully stopped. 4 men in charcoal suits, the same unyielding shadows Amara had seen in the boardroom, stepped out. They didn't pull weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere from a mugging to a battlefield. From the passenger side, Min-ho, Kang's right-hand security lead, stepped forward. He didn't look at Julian, he didn't look at the fixers. He walked straight to Amara and stood between her and the men who meant to hurt her. Mr. Kang is not fond of people touching his property, and as of 5 minutes ago, Ms. Vance, you are considered a high-value asset of the Aegis Group. Julian took a step back, his bravado vanishing as he realized he wasn't just fighting a janitor anymore, he was fighting a ghost with an army. As Min-ho's men moved forward with clinical efficiency, the invisible woman realized that for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't the one being hunted. 3 weeks had passed, but the air on the 60th floor of the Aegis Tower still carried the faint, ghostly scent of lemon-scented industrial cleaner, a smell that served as a tether to the woman Amara Vance used to be. This time, however, the heavy oak doors didn't groan open to admit a mop bucket and a shadow. They glided wide to welcome a woman in a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a sharp professional knot that mirrored the precision of her mind. Amara didn't look at the floor as she walked. She didn't have to. She knew every inch of the Italian marble, every scuff she had once labored to remove. But as she approached the mahogany boardroom table, the perspective had shifted. She was no longer looking at the world from the periphery. She moved toward the head of the table, her leather heels clicking with a rhythmic authority that silenced the low murmur of the gathered executives. Kang De-hyun was already seated, his unreadable gaze fixed on a new set of documents. He didn't look up as she approached, but he slid a leather-bound folder toward the empty chair to his right, the seat Julian Sterling had once occupied with such unearned smugness. Amara pulled the chair out, the heavy wood feeling solid and real beneath her hands. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't a footnote or a clerical error. She was the lead internal auditor of a global empire. Across the table, a new group of prospective partners watched her with a mixture of curiosity and wary respect. They didn't see a janitor, they saw a gatekeeper. Amara opened the folder, her eyes instantly locking onto the mathematical patterns that spoke to her in a language no one else in the room truly understood. She felt the weight of the black embossed card in her pocket, the key that had opened this door, and thought of her mother, Ifeoma, whose medical bills were now being paid by a woman who had reclaimed her name. "The terms in Section 2 are acceptable," Amara said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of absolute expertise. "But I've flagged a discrepancy in the amortization schedule on page 14. We'll need to restructure the debt-to-equity ratio before Mr. Kang signs." Kang finally looked up, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, a look of recognition between two people who knew that the most dangerous weapon in a room isn't a gun or a contract, but the person who can see the truth hidden in the ink. Amara leaned back, her hands folded over the ledger. She was no longer a ghost haunting the building. She was the one who owned the shadows now. The shell game was over, and for the first time in her life, Amara Vance was the one holding all the cups. From the shadows of the executive suite to the head of the boardroom table, Amara Vance proved that being invisible doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the pen or the one with the title. It's the one who knows how to read between the lines and has the courage to speak up when it counts. In a world where everyone is playing a shell game, Amara chose to stop being a pawn and started being the queen. She reclaimed her name, saved an empire, and made sure her mother would never have to worry about a hospital bill again. But this is just the beginning for her. With Kang De-hyun by her side and her forensic mind back in the game, the people who framed her better start looking over their shoulders. What did you think of Amara's journey? Did she take too big of a risk, or was it the only way to get her life back? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on our invisible auditor. If you enjoyed this high-stakes corporate thriller, make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to see part 2, where Amara and Kang finally track down Dominic Graves to settle the score, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. We drop a new cinematic narrative every week. Thanks for watching, and remember, keep your eyes open because the truth is usually hiding in plain sight. I'll see you in the next one.